Please welcome to the stage General Wesley Clark of Renew America Together.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So it's my privilege up here representing the Leadership Council of Concordia to present the annual Concordia Leadership Award. This award recognizes public, private, and civil society leaders who've made transformational contributions in their field. Each year, we honor those leaders who've made a more prosperous, secure, and sustainable future for all of us, and who turn their inspirational vision into real impact. Past public sector recipients include Laura Bush, former First Lady of the United States; Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations; Secretary Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State of the United States; His Excellency Ivan Duque, former President, Republic of Colombia; Madame Monica Guingos, third First Lady of the Republic of Namibia; Dr. Muhammad Yunus, Chairman of the Yunus Center. And so today, we're going to recognize NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. I've been associated with NATO really in a personal way since 1979. I was a major working for General Alexander Haig when he was the first Supreme Allied Commander, and I got to know Secretary General Joseph Luns quite well. It was an awesome job because the Secretary General had to balance all the work done by NATO's 14 nations at the time. And since then, it's only grown more and more complex as NATO has added membership and taken on greater security responsibilities. In the Cold War, it was about deterrence, and it was about making sure the Allies lived up to their contributions for defense sector expenditures. But there was no war to speak of. That changed in the 1990s when NATO Secretary General Manfred Werner said that NATO had to go out of area or go out of business. And so that's when NATO became involved in the Balkans. And it was my privilege as NATO Commander, SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, 1997 to 2000, to work for NATO Secretary General Javier Solana. And we had to implement the Dayton Peace Accords, and then we had to prevent Serb ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, which we did through a 78-day air campaign and the threat of a ground invasion, and Kosovo's an independent country today. I thought Secretary General Solana had a really tough job. Nations were all over the map in terms of supporting the bombing and people saying, when are you going to stop this? And there were mistakes and lots of tension, and Solana adroitly managed NATO's 15 nations at the time, or 16 nations. We'd brought in Hungary, we brought in Poland, we brought in Warsaw, so it made it 19 at the time. And I thought, boy, that's a tough job. But it's gotten only tougher. And so I've watched as Secretary General Stoltenberg has been NATO Secretary General longer than anyone in history. He was he was the Prime Minister of Norway, twice, in fact. He's a lifelong public servant. And when he took this job at NATO in 2014, he knew that there was a little bit of trouble starting in Ukraine, but I'm sure he had no idea what was going to happen. He's been extended in his position, and I can say there's never been a Secretary General who's had a tougher time for a longer time and done it better and more successfully, balancing now 30 nations in NATO with all of their differences, all of their concerns, and Russia engaged in war in Ukraine. So Secretary Stoltenberg is one of my heroes, and I hope he's one of yours. And it's my honor on behalf of the Concordia Leadership Council to welcome NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg on stage to receive the Concordia Leadership Award for his many significant contributions and his inspired leadership of NATO. Thank you. And I'm going to present it to Thank you. Thank you very much. And now, what I'd like to do is introduce retired General Phil Breedlove, a former NATO Supreme Allied Commander who worked under the leadership of Secretary General Stoltenberg. And Phil is going to moderate a discussion of the importance of the transatlantic alliance, the transformative decisions Secretary General Stoltenberg has made, and his leadership of NATO. General Breedlove, please. Secretary General, again, congratulations.
Well, sir, it's good to be back together again. We're an old team. As was introduced, I was on your team as you began your tour as a Secretary General. Before we start our conversation, 5 quick words from me. Congratulations, well done, and thank you.
Thank you.
Our world is a better place for your leadership in NATO. So, as Wes sort of introduced at the beginning of our tours, Mr. Putin decided that he would amass his army, march across an internationally recognized border, and invade Ukraine. And you and your leadership, and I as the leader of your military team, we had to react. Our summit together was the Wales Summit, and lots of big change were made at Wales. But you have since gone through multiple summits, from Wales to Washington, and NATO has improved its readiness and its forward presence all along the way. What do you see that has been done that you're proud to have accomplished, and what do you see that yet needs to be done?
So first of all, let me thank you for having me here, and I remember very well that we worked together. You were the SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander, when I arrived as a totally new Secretary General. You had a lot of experience. You had a very nice castle you lived in, actually. At least yeah, it was a beautiful place, and we had a lunch there, I think. But let me start by sharing with you a paradox, and that is that when I was first approached by some allied leaders late 2013 and early 2014 in January, and they asked me whether I was willing to consider to become the Secretary General of NATO. Actually, things were quite quiet. And I remember I asked my father. He had been a diplomat in the Norwegian Foreign Service since the 1950s, foreign and defense minister, and I asked him for advice, and he said, "You should not do that. It's so quiet, nothing happens in NATO." That was in January. Then when I took up my post in October that year, then we had, Russia had annexed Crimea. They had gone into eastern Donbass. And we had ISIS controlling a territory in Iraq and Syria, the size of the United Kingdom, I remember we used as a comparison, 8 million people. So then things were totally different. And since then, we have seen more global rivalry. We have seen Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We've also seen more terrorist cyber attacks. So in short, the world has become more dangerous over the last decade. That's the bad news. The good news is that NATO is stronger. Because, and when you ask what I'm proud of, well, I'm proud of that I have been part of an effort by all NATO allies to ensure that when the world is changing, when the world is becoming more dangerous, we are able to change as NATO. And that's exactly what we have done. Because at that time in 2014, we had no combat-ready NATO troops in the eastern part of the alliance. Today we have 10 combat-ready battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance. We had a few thousand high-readiness forces. Now we have 500,000 forces which are allocated to NATO on high readiness. And perhaps most importantly, back in 2014, when we were together at the Wales Summit, we made the decision to increase defense spending, that allies should spend 2% of GDP on defense. At that time, 3 allies spent 2% or more on defense. And that was Greece, the United States, and the United Kingdom. And I see that Theresa May is here, and the United Kingdom has actually been leading on defense spending for decades. That was in 2014. Today, in 2024, 23 allies are spending 2% or more on defense. Actually, Poland, the Baltic states are significantly there, 3–4%. So they are significantly above 2%. And those allies are not yet at 2%, has plans in place to be there quite soon. So that has changed dramatically. So they are now investing heavily in more modern capabilities. Let me also add that all of this, the big transformation of NATO that started in 2014 because of Russia's annexation of Crimea, made it possible for us to actually be prepared for the full-scale invasion that happened in 2022. I'm not saying that we knew in 2014 that they would go to a full-scale invasion in 2022, also of Ukraine. But we knew that the world had become much more dangerous, so we had to invest more in defense. So when the full-scale invasion happened, we had more forces to deploy to the eastern part of the alliance. We had new defense plans that gave Sakir even more authorities to move troops and to send a clear message to Moscow. And we had the resources to step up significantly our support to Ukraine. So we have implemented the biggest transformation, the biggest reinforcement of NATO's collective defense over these 10 years. But there is obviously a need to do more. The good news is that we are at 2%. The bad news is that 2% is not longer enough. If we look at the defense plans we have, the capability targets which we have in NATO, we agree what each and every ally should have of forces, capabilities, readiness. There is no way allies can meet those targets without spending significantly more than 2%. So, in short, world more dangerous, NATO stronger, still a long way to go.
It's been a really tough work, and it's been fun to watch you maneuver this, because it's not easy to get countries to make these new kinds of commitments. And as you remember, NATO had been in a period of over 2 decades where we were hugging the bear and trying to bring Russia towards the West and normalize operations, but Russia was not really ready for that. And those 2 decades you can't cover over in 2 or 3 years of 2%. And I couldn't agree with you more that it is going to take additional investment. So many times as I'm out on the road, I am questioned by people about, okay, what is the relevance of NATO? Why are we still worried about NATO? And I offer a refrain that many others use, and that is that NATO has been the most successful military alliance in the history of the world, for sure in our histories, in recorded recent history. So, in your opinion, what does the next 75 years of NATO look like?
I cannot tell that, or to say with certainty, because if you look backwards, I think the people back then were not able to predict what was going to happen today. But what I can say is that whatever happens, whatever the next crisis will be, we are just safer together than alone. And we're much more capable of dealing with that regardless of what kind of crisis. Then I would also like to say that the relevance of NATO is fundamentally the same today than it was when NATO was established in 1949. And that is to preserve peace, prevent war. The purpose of NATO is not to fight the war, to wage war. The purpose of NATO is to prevent war. And NATO has done that successfully for the NATO allies for 75 years. By sending a very clear message to any potential adversary, the Soviet Union, Russia, and others, that if one ally is attacked, that's an attack on all allies. And by doing that, we are preventing war. That's the success of NATO. Because sometimes people believe that, in a way, it's when we fight the war that we really demonstrate our strength. No, it's the ultimate success of NATO is to prevent anyone from attacking us. And again, in a world where we see that Russia and China are more and more aligned, we see how China is supporting Russia's efforts in war efforts in Ukraine by propping up the Russian war economy. North Korea and Iran are supporting the Russian war against Ukraine. Then when these authoritarian powers are more and more closely aligned, it's even more important that we stay aligned. Then since I'm in the United States, let me say that for me it's obvious that it's good for Europe to have NATO. Because then the United States is there to, and Canada, North America are there to help to protect us. And 2 world wars taught us that we need to stand together. But in the United States, there are some who ask the questions, do we need NATO? The United States, and my answer is yes. Because even the United States has a great advantage of having friends and allies. The United States is big. You are 25% of the world's GDP. But together with all the NATO allies, we are 50%, twice as much of the GDP, the global GDP. And 50% of the world's military might. And you have big powers, or you have the United Kingdom, you have Germany, France, and others, but also smaller powers like, or allies, like Iceland and Norway, not very big, but extremely important for the North Atlantic link.
Yes.
Turkey in the south, extremely important to fight ISIS. And the reason why China and Russia always attacks NATO is that they know, they see how NATO is making the United States stronger. So they want to weaken NATO to weaken the United States. And they don't have anything like the United States. They don't have, so the United States have more than 30 friends and allies in NATO. Russia doesn't have that. China doesn't have that. So that makes you stronger. Then I accept that the United States, there have been, what I say, complaints about European allies not carrying their part of the burden. That has been fair criticism. President Obama said it clearly when we had the Wales summit in 2014. President Trump said it many times. And Biden has fundamentally conveyed the same message. But the good news is that this has changed because European allies have started to pay. So now you are not that alone anymore. More and more allies are investing in defense, and that's my main message to the US is to understand that NATO is good for Europe, but NATO is also good for the United States.
So as a SACEUR, some 10 years ago now, or 8 years ago I retired, I was always wishing that Finland and Sweden would find their way into our great alliance. Having been the air commander, you remember, in Europe before I was the SACEUR, I had flown with, exercised with, trained with those 2 air forces. And the nations, their militaries, were already well prepared to be a NATO member. It was like a light switch when they joined. They were immediately contributing. So I must congratulate you on navigating those as we bring those partners aboard. I think they're even more important to us today as we face a Russia that is less and less deterred outside of NATO spaces. I believe our deterrence is still very strong inside NATO spaces. So how do you see, what are your thoughts about a good ending for Ukraine in Ukraine?
I will answer that question in a moment. I'll just say a few words about Finland and Sweden first, because you have to remember that President Putin went to war, and just weeks before he invaded the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he sent a treaty to NATO and to the United States, where he wanted NATO to sign on a treaty where we guaranteed no more members, to close NATO's door for new membership. And he wanted to prevent Ukraine from becoming a member, of course, but he also wanted any other country in Europe to become a member of NATO. And he wanted NATO to agree to remove its forces from the Eastern Partner Alliance. That was part of the treaty we actually discussed with the Russians as late as in January 2022. So he wanted less NATO. That was one of the reasons he invaded Ukraine. He's getting exactly the opposite.
Exactly.
He's getting Ukraine closer to NATO than ever before. And now Finland and Sweden are members of the alliance. And let me just tell you that I, as a Norwegian, a neighbor of both of them, I thought that was impossible a few years ago. Now they both are members. And Finland, as a member, you know, that doubled NATO's border with Russia, 1,300 kilometers. That's the Finnish border. And the Finns have strong defense forces, so that has really added, also Sweden, has really added. Yeah. Then how can it end as the end as well? Ukraine, first of all, it has to be for the Ukrainians to decide what is an acceptable solution to the war. That's not for us, that's for the Ukrainians. Our responsibility is to enable them to get the solution where they survive as a sovereign, independent nation in Europe. And the only way to achieve that is to provide military support to Ukraine. Because now President Putin believes that he can wait us out, that he will win on the battlefield. I don't think we can change President Putin's mind, but I think we can change his calculus. That if the price he pays for that war is too high, then even he will be willing to accept that Ukraine survives as a sovereign, independent nation. So if we want a negotiated solution to this, which is acceptable for Ukraine, weapons to Ukraine is the path to peace. That's the paradox. Let me also say that, of course, I know, and you all know, that the situation on the battlefield is difficult. But remember where this war started. When the war started, most experts, also in our own capitals, told us that Kiev would fall within days and Ukraine within weeks. That didn't happen. The Ukrainians have liberated 50% of the territory that the Russians controlled in the beginning. They have opened a big corridor in the Black Sea, sank a lot of Russian ships, and they are inflicting heavy losses on the Russians. So we need to support them. We have the economic strength. We have the capacity to do so. So this is about political will to provide enough support to Ukraine so they prevail.
Well said, sir. Will you all join me in congratulating and thanking the Secretary?
Thanks.